After the mysterious events in the basement tunnels, I had a couple days off, then had to switch over to night shift, as we all did every 2 weeks. The lack of sleep and changeover always played havoc with my circadian rhythm, and my brain always felt fuzzy and wrong for a few days every time I switched from days to nights or back again. On my days off, I would be plagued by headaches that started as a dull ache behind my eyes until they turned to gnawing migraines that forced me into darkened rooms to sit alone with my thoughts until I fell asleep. It was 3 a.m. on my second night shift when the phone rang in the switchboard office. It was so quiet I could hear her pick up the phone and answer. Switchboard, Lisa speaking. Hello? Hello? Anyone there? She came back to the security office and I put down my pen. I had been working on a Sudoku puzzle that was seeming more like a hard difficulty than a medium and had only gotten one number down. That was weird, she said, popping her head in. What's that? Someone just called from the old trades building, but they didn't say anything. The trades building was one of the outbuildings that was connected to the main hospital. Like many of those, it was old and in disrepair, no longer used for its intended purpose. It was now more of just an overflow storage space with a couple of usable workshops that the repairmen seldom used. I'll go check it out, I said, not relishing the prospect of walking out there by myself. The only other guard who wasn't locked in a control booth was Doug, and he was on his break trying to take a nap. Didn't want to wake him up. It wasn't our local customs. I walked out to the trades building in the brisk night air. It took a while to get out there, and I admired the stars as I walked. It was a full moon. Bats were flying through the air above and hunting for bugs. I watched them and was surprised at their numbers. When I got to the trades building, I looked at the window closest to me and thought I saw movement inside. I pulled out my walkie-talkie and called into the switchboard office, telling her to wake up Doug. Stand by to call the police as well. I think I saw movement in the building. Be careful, Jordan. If there's someone in there, it's probably better if you just wait for the police. It could be a burglar. I'm gonna check it out from the outside, see if I can see anything. I walked up to the building and started testing doors to see if they were locked. I walked around the perimeter, putting my face up to the glass and looking inside. It appeared empty. I pulled out my radio and called back to the office, saying I was going to check inside. The building looked unoccupied. Lisa told me the police were on their way and to be careful. She hadn't seen Doug in the break room, but he would have heard us on the radio by now, so he probably started walking out to the trades building. I unlocked the side door and walked in. I used my flashlight to see as I walked from room to room, looking inside. I thought I heard something from the room ahead of me and to my right, and walked forward, trying not to panic. I walked into the room and looked around. It was filled with welding equipment. The door suddenly slammed shut behind me. I turned around, startled, my heart suddenly in my throat. How? I didn't even have time to complete the thought before something to my right caught my eye. It was a body on the ground with a pool of fresh, bright blood surrounding it. I couldn't see where all the blood was coming from, but there was a lot of it. As I looked closer, I saw she was far beyond my help. I recognized her face, too. It was Rhonda, the records clerk who worked in the basement. I could have imagined it, but as I stood there staring at her body, my jaw agape, I thought I heard the soft, playful laugh of a small girl from somewhere distant, yet somehow echoing in the room. The police arrived a few minutes later, after I called into the office to report what I had discovered. Doug waddled up to the scene about 10 minutes after the police arrived, looking sleepy, asking what he had missed. I told him, and he did a double take, blinking his eyes and looking suddenly wide awake. Rhonda? Seriously? He looked shaken for a moment. What was the scene in there like? Any ideas what might have happened? I told him about the door slamming shut behind me. He paused, then said the same thing had happened to him a couple times in that building. There was a constant draft in there. It seemed plausible, though I had never noticed it happening, and the timing of it had been spooky to say the least. I hadn't heard footsteps or anyone running away, though. I had checked the halls just after that, too, and found them empty. Doug told me he recognized one of the cops from when he used to volunteer at the police station. He went over, saying he was going to try to get some more info for us. He got over to the crowd of police, and I was surprised to see almost all of them immediately recognized him, and they seemed to be on friendly terms. He chatted with them jovially, and I was surprised to see him looking so animated and conversational. He had always been a bit of a grouch in my experience, who kept to himself mostly and didn't talk much. The longer he stayed and talked with them, the more I began to realize he had no intention of coming back to talk to me. He seemed to have forgotten I was there. I walked back towards the hospital, slightly embarrassed and annoyed with him. A couple of days later, it was like the whole incident had been forgotten. The death had been ruled a suicide, although the circumstances had been seen more than suspicious to me. My story about the door slamming shut behind me, for instance, had been written off as a drafty building, just as Doug had suggested. For good measure, the entire hospital grounds had been swept by a police search party. At least that's what they said. I couldn't help but notice the old cobwebs remained untouched down long sections of derelict tunnels where obviously the police hadn't ventured. It was understandable. The place was too massive to do a proper search, and too many areas were locked off and dangerous due to the old and decaying construction. Another unsettling development was that Sam, the toady pedophile man, had absconded and not been seen for days. Since the day of the little girl's voice in the basement room, in fact. I had mentioned it to the police, but they seemed preoccupied now with Rhonda's apparent suicide, and were seeming less and less interested in what I had to say. They seemed to dismiss my thoughts as delusional. Besides, patients absconded all the time, as I've said before. Sam had disappeared at least a half dozen times before, each time turning up after riding the bus to the nearest major city, trying to blend in to disappear. The cops were always on the lookout for him. He was usually found relatively quickly. I mentioned to Philip, the supervisor, that Sam was missing, and I wondered if it could have something to do with the little girl in the basement. I said the police hadn't searched the tunnels properly and she could still be down there. Do you want to go down there and search those tunnels? Because I can give you a flashlight, but I'm sure as hell not going with you. He snapped at me. I had never seen him angry with a coworker before. He was one of the nicest people I knew in the hospital. I tried to ask him if I had done something wrong, but he had just huffed and walked away as if it was a stupid question. Despite the tension between Philip and I, there was still the matter of training the new hire who had just joined the team. He was in the room during the exchange between Philip and me, sitting there awkwardly. His name was Matt, and he looked to be in his early 20s. His longish brown hair was slicked back with far too much gel, and he looked a bit white in the face. There had been a lot of action around here lately. I had a feeling he wouldn't last long. Sorry about that, Matt, I said. Usually this place is a lot tamer, really. Uh-huh, he said, looking unconvinced. Let's go out for a patrol. I think you'll see this place isn't so bad. Our first patrol was uneventful. The sun had faded behind the horizon, but we still had enough daylight to finish walking to the outbuildings and back before it got dark. As we walked past an old house on the outer edge of the property, Matt pointed and asked, "What's that building?" "That's Century Manor," I told him. "That's where the patients lived over 100 years ago, back in the days when the mental patients had to grow their own food, cook their own meals, and pay the hospital's overhead costs with their labor, making clothes and blankets for sale to the markets in the city." "How do you know all this stuff?" he asked. There's educational posters hanging up in the lobby with big black and white photos of the hospital back in those days, I said. That building has been boarded up for decades, though. No one goes in or out. What's with the little girl up in the window then? He asked. I looked up in surprise, my heart pounding. Where? I grabbed him, shaking him. Maybe I was just seeing things, I don't know. I thought I saw a little girl up in that window right there. I looked up at the window where he was pointing, but didn't see anything. We checked all the doors, but they were fastened tight with chains and padlocks, just like the rooms in the basement, I thought. I hailed Philip on the radio. He was working for another hour and still had the big key ring. He called back, sounding annoyed. What do you want? Matt says he thinks he saw a little girl on the top floor of Century Manor looking out the window at us. Considering the events of the last few days, do you think maybe we should check it out? I'll call the police. They can check it out. Just come back to the office when you get a chance. I need to trade key sets with you so I can go home. The nightly ritual was for the supervisor to give the big key ring to the night guard, so they had it in case of emergency. The smaller set of keys would be locked in a drawer for safekeeping. I wished I could stay to check the house with the police, but who knew how long it would take for them to come. I called up to the window a few times, seeing if I could get the girl to come back, but she didn't. We hung around as long as we could, then finished our patrol and made our way back to the office. Philip gave me the bigger set of keys, saying the police had been to the house and checked it out right after we left. It was empty, of course. He looked even more pissed off now than before, as if my actions were somehow jeopardizing his future career with the police force. I resolved to check all the doors and windows of Century Manor when we got back out there for our late night patrol. If there was a window or door open or another secret way in, we would find it. I considered I could just use the key on the big ring, but was worried about going into the house. It was condemned and falling apart. The floors and ceilings were no longer considered safe to bear weight and were reportedly sagging and buckling in places. I had never been inside. It was against protocol because of the safety concerns. I spent the next few hours in the office showing Matt how to file an incident report, how to call in a code white, and other essential things he would need to know to do his job. There wasn't really that much, and I felt a bit empty inside when I realized I was done and had showed a stranger off the street how to do my job in a few hours. I had no delusions about my job security. I was highly replaceable. I told Matt we would start our next patrol, and we put on our radio belts and headed out the door, telling Lisa where we were going in case there was a code. We made our way hastily around the hospital. I checked the doors on the right to make sure they were locked. Matt checked the doors on the left. A quick pull on each doorknob before moving on to the next one. The security guard shuffled. We made it outside, and I headed straight for Century Manor, even though that wasn't my usual route. I had a bad feeling. I had to see what was there for myself. When we got to the building, we did our doorknob dance, walking around the outside, checking the windows visually as we went. When I got to the back door, the last one to check, I pulled on the doorknob and felt it was locked. How sure are you it was a kid you saw up in that window? I asked. I'm pretty sure. I mean, yeah, it looked like it. I know eyes can play tricks sometimes though, right? When I looked back up there and she was gone, it just seemed like I must have imagined it. Why? I took a deep breath. He knew why. I'm going inside. I think you should stay out here. It's not safe in there, and what I'm about to do is against the rules, big time. He didn't argue. I turned around, and after a few minutes of trial and error, found the right key. The lock turned with an effort. I opened the door and looked inside. I told Matt that if I didn't come out in a few minutes, he should call the police. We each had a radio, but I turned the volume on mine down. If there was someone else in there with the little girl, I didn't want them to know I was coming. I stepped inside, and the smell of mildew and old dust filled my nostrils. It was pitch black inside. I walked forward with my flashlight in hand, looking above me in dismay at the sagging ceiling above me. The room I entered looked like a very old kitchen, with every appliance and counter covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. I tried to be silent, remembering an old detective book for kids I had read when I was younger that had said to stick to the sides of hallways and staircases to avoid making them creak when trying to be sneaky. I made my way deeper into the house and found the staircase to the right of the main entrance. I was about to go up the stairs, since that was where Matt had seen the girl last, when I heard something from below me. It sounded like a little girl laughing, or maybe she was crying. Turning around, I made my way back to the middle of the house where I had seen stairs leading to the basement. I walked down them slowly and stuck to the sides, the edges where it didn't creak so much. As I got down to the basement, I heard the sound again. It was a little girl, and she sounded like she was laughing, not crying. I was afraid, but my curiosity drew me down the stairs, and I found myself on the completely pitch black lower level. I continued deeper into the dungeon-like basement, the cold stone floor wet beneath my feet. The smell down here was worse, damp and moldy, with something else acrid and unidentifiable beneath. I walked forward and entered a large room. I saw at the other end a little girl swinging her legs, sitting on the edge of a plastic-wrapped table, smiling broadly. My throat was choked with fear, and I found myself unable to speak. There was someone else in the room as well. I could hear them moving around. I went in further and stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the scene on the floor. Someone was down on their hands and knees, sawing away with a hacksaw at the upper arm of what appeared to be Sam, the toad-like pedophile man. A pile of limbs were set aside as he finished off detaching the arm. He threw it onto the pile. The floor was covered with tarps and plastic sheets, as were the walls and everything in the area. Blood splatters stood out stark red against the white and blue background of plastic. "Daddy, look! Someone came to our clubhouse to play with us. Can I play surgeon and you be the nurse this time, Daddy, please?" The man stood up, and I realized with a shock that it looked like Doug, his face obscured mostly by shadows. Of course, fucking Doug. No wonder everyone had been treating me so strangely. Doug was a lunatic who had been gaslighting them all behind my back, telling them I was bonkers, that I had been acting really weird, and maybe I should see someone, a professional someone. He had talked to the cops and Philip and convinced them of his bullshit door slamming must have been the goddamn wind story of his Rhonda suicide theory. Who knew what other lies he could have been feeding them? I looked around and noticed the windows down here were all boarded up so no one could see in from the outside. He must have made a key from the big ring when he was alone on night shift so he could come and go as he pleased. Before Doug could do anything, I ran out of there as fast as I could to the sound of Samantha giggling behind me. They didn't even try to chase me, just let me go. I ran outside and pulled Matt away from the house, taking out my phone and dialing 911. It took 3 attempts. My hands were shaking so badly. The cops came in record time as I watched the back of the house and Matt watched the front. We called into the switchboard and asked them to send additional staff for backup support. By the time the police arrived, there was a crowd of 20 nurses, security guards, healthcare aides, and myself standing outside the old house, with more arriving by the minute. My story had gotten around to everyone. They all knew there was a killer inside. The thing is, the police went in SWAT style and came out 20 minutes later shaking their heads. There was no one in the basement or anywhere in the house. The place was dangerous, with ceilings looking ready to cave in any second, so they didn't spend more than an hour inside searching. Each one who came out had a strange look on their face for me, and I heard them talking softly to each other with their backs turned to me, glancing my way occasionally and trying not to point. The whole time I kept thinking, they have to find something down there. A bloody hacksaw, a severed fingered something. Staff members had started heading back to the hospital shaking their heads and whispering to each other. Matt said he hadn't seen anything, although he conveyed his possible sighting of a girl on the second floor earlier, saying he hadn't been sure what he had seen. I was accused of filing a false police report, a serious charge, but they ended up dropping it later after my psych evaluation. I was suspended from work pending an investigation. I had numerous meetings with bigwigs at headquarters, always with union representatives present, who had lots of good ideas on how to allow me to keep my job. They suggested I go see a psychiatrist. The doctor examined me and promptly diagnosed me with severe PTSD. He said he couldn't determine the source of my childhood trauma without extensive talk therapy, but explained that I had experienced a flashback of the event, something horrible in my past. He prescribed me some medication which I pretended to take, a bright yellow and white capsule and a blue oblong tablet. I eventually was allowed to come back to work, but no one treated me the same. I was told Doug had left, citing personal reasons for his departure, saying his younger daughter had health issues. When I asked what her name was, I was told to mind my own business. There was no record of either of them on Google either. I wanted to see a picture of her to compare to the little girl I'd seen in the basement. One day shortly after I returned from my suspension, another security guard, a wise older man from Afghanistan who had been a chemistry professor back home, said something that stuck with me. "You know, Jordan," he said, his voice thickly accented, "we become like the people we surround ourselves with, the people we spend time with, and here we're surrounded by mental patients." He left me to sit with the idea, saying but not saying who he was referring to. I just can't help but keep wondering, what's down in the tunnels below the hospital? Is there a sub-basement below the basement? I know I've seen stairs leading downward from the basement into what appeared to be a mechanical section. Is there a tunnel or tunnels down there no one knows about? One that goes from Century Manor to the main building, to the trades building, and to the west end of the basement? I'm determined to find out. Doug is not going to get away with this.